What if I told you that the most famous alien abduction case in history contains evidence that was deliberately hidden from the public for decades? What if the physical traces left behind were far more disturbing than anyone admits? And what if the government files that were finally declassified reveal that officials knew something was genuine about this encounter, but chose silence over truth? Tonight, we're going deep into the shadows of the Betty and Barney Hill case, but not the story you've heard 1,000 times before. We're exploring the evidence that researchers overlook, the psychological details that make skeptics uncomfortable, and the government documents that suggest this case was taken far more seriously behind closed doors than anyone wanted to admit. This isn't just a retelling. This is an investigation into what really happened when two ordinary people encountered something that changed them forever, and why, after more than 60 years, this case still refuses to be explained away. If you've ever wondered whether there's more to this story than dreams and hypnosis, stay with me, because what we're about to uncover might change how you think about not just this case, but every unexplained encounter that's followed. Let's begin by examining the one aspect of this case that everyone gets wrong. Before we dive into the night of September 19, 1961, we need to understand something crucial that most documentaries and articles completely miss. Betty and Barney Hill were not the kind of people who see UFOs. This wasn't a case of believers looking for confirmation or attention seekers crafting a story. In fact, their backgrounds made them perhaps the least likely candidates to fabricate such an account, and that's precisely what made investigators take notice. Barney Hill was a World War II veteran working for the United States Postal Service, a man who had spent years fighting for civil rights in an era when doing so required extraordinary courage. As an African-American man in 1960s New Hampshire, married to a white woman, Barney already faced daily scrutiny and judgment. The absolute last thing he wanted was more attention, especially the kind that would make him look unstable or unreliable. His colleagues described him as methodical, rational, and deeply private. He was someone who thought through problems logically and didn't make claims he couldn't support. Betty Hill worked as a social worker, a profession that required her to assess situations clearly, document events accurately, and maintain professional credibility. Her job involved investigating family situations, writing reports that could determine a child's future, and testifying in legal proceedings. She understood better than most people how quickly credibility could be lost and how important it was to distinguish between what someone believed and what could be proven. She wasn't given to flights of fancy or dramatic interpretations of ordinary events. Their marriage itself was an act of courage. Interracial marriage was still controversial and in some states actually illegal at that time. They faced social ostracism, subtle and sometimes overt discrimination, and the constant awareness that their relationship was being judged by others. They had built their life together carefully, maintaining dignity in the face of prejudice and building a reputation in their community based on solid work and civic participation. They were not people who courted controversy or sought the spotlight.
This context matters enormously because when they finally did come forward with their story, they had everything to lose and nothing to gain. Barney in particular resisted publicizing what happened, knowing it would subject them to ridicule and potentially damage his standing in the community. The fact that they eventually shared their account anyway, despite these very real costs, suggests something profound occurred that they simply couldn't ignore or explain away. Understanding who Betty and Barney Hill were before that September night helps us appreciate why investigators found their testimony so compelling. These weren't people prone to fantasy or seeking attention. They were grounded, practical individuals who found themselves facing something that challenged everything they thought they knew about reality. And that's where the real mystery begins, not with what they saw in the sky, but with what happened to them afterward, and how their personalities, their credibility, and their very understanding of themselves were tested by an experience that refused to fit into any rational framework they possessed.
Let's talk about something that rarely gets the attention it deserves in discussions of this case:
the physical evidence. Not the dramatic stuff, not flying saucers or mysterious beings, but the quiet, persistent anomalies that remained long after that night ended. The things that couldn't be explained away by suggestion or false memory or cultural contamination. Start with the dress. Betty's blue dress, the one she wore that night, showed damage that made no immediate sense. There were tears near the hem, strange triangular cuts along the zipper, and most puzzling of all, a fine pinkish powder that appeared on certain sections of the fabric days after the incident. This wasn't ordinary dust or dirt. When she shook the dress, it came off in small clouds that seemed to shimmer slightly in certain light. Betty, being methodical, saved some of this residue in a sealed bag and stored the dress separately, understanding instinctively that it might be important. Years later, when laboratories finally examined the dress, they found something disturbing. The areas affected by the pink powder showed unusual chemical degradation, as though the fabric had been exposed to something that broke down its molecular structure in ways that didn't match any common environmental factor. Some tests revealed traces of proteins and unusual acid concentrations that couldn't be easily explained. The results were never formally published, partly because they raised more questions than they answered, and partly because no laboratory wanted to stake its reputation on findings that suggested something genuinely anomalous. Then there were the watches. Both Betty's and Barney's watches stopped that night, frozen at exactly 3:07 in the morning. This might seem like a small detail, easily dismissed as coincidence, but consider what it means. Two separate timepieces, both functioning normally before the incident, both stopping at the same moment, both never functioning again despite attempts to repair them. Watchmakers examined them and found nothing mechanically wrong, no broken parts, no obvious damage. They simply refused to work, as though something had fundamentally altered them at a level that couldn't be detected through normal examination. The car presented its own mysteries. Days after their return, Barney noticed a series of circular, shiny spots on the trunk lid. These weren't there before the trip. They were perfectly round, slightly raised, and arranged in a pattern that followed no obvious logic. When Betty held a compass near these spots, the needle began to spin erratically. Move the compass away, and it stabilized immediately. Try again, same result. The spots appeared to be interfering with magnetic fields in a way that shouldn't have been possible if they were simply paint or some kind of residue. What makes this physical evidence so compelling is its mundane quality. These aren't spectacular claims of burns or radiation or alien artifacts. They're small, persistent anomalies that resisted easy explanation. The Hills didn't publicize most of these details initially. They documented them privately, showing them only to investigators who specifically asked. This wasn't evidence manufactured for attention. It was evidence they were trying to understand themselves. Barney's shoes presented another puzzle. The leather was scuffed and scraped in ways that suggested he'd been walking through rough terrain, yet he had no memory of doing so. The wear pattern didn't match normal use. It was as though the shoes had been dragged or scraped against something abrasive, but neither he nor Betty could recall any activity during their trip that would have caused such damage. They'd spent most of their time in the car or at tourist sites with paved walkways. The condition of the shoes didn't fit the trip they remembered taking. There were also the strange marks on Barney's body. Small circular patches appeared on his skin near his groin, wart-like growths that doctors examined but couldn't clearly identify. They appeared shortly after the incident and persisted for months. Medical professionals who examined them found them unusual but couldn't link them to any known condition or environmental cause. Barney found them disturbing not just because they were uncomfortable, but because they seemed connected to an experience he couldn't fully remember or explain. What ties all this physical evidence together is its consistency with the accounts that would later emerge under hypnosis. The marks on Barney's body corresponded to areas where he would recall being examined. The damage to Betty's dress matched her later description of being moved and handled during the examination. The stopped watches aligned with the period of missing time they would eventually identify. None of this evidence proved alien contact, but it did suggest that something physical happened to them that left traces, something more than a dream or hallucination. The skeptical explanation for all this evidence typically involves multiple unrelated coincidences occurring during the same narrow window of time. The watches failed simultaneously by chance. The dress was damaged and contaminated by some unknown environmental factor. The car developed magnetic anomalies through natural means. The shoes were worn down during forgotten moments of the trip. Barney's skin conditions arose from stress or psychosomatic causes. Each individual piece of evidence could potentially be explained away, but taken together, they form a pattern that becomes increasingly difficult to dismiss as mere coincidence.
Now we need to talk about the hypnosis sessions with Dr. Benjamin Simon, because this is where the case gets truly fascinating and deeply complex. Most retellings focus on what Betty and Barney said under hypnosis, the descriptions of the craft, the beings, the examinations. But what rarely gets examined is how they said it, the way their responses emerged, the emotional reactions that accompanied their words, and the careful methodology that Dr. Simon employed to keep their accounts separate and untainted. Dr. Benjamin Simon was not a believer in UFOs. He was a respected psychiatrist who had specialized in treating combat veterans suffering from trauma and psychosomatic symptoms. His approach was clinical, skeptical, and methodical. When he agreed to work with the Hills, his goal was not to investigate a UFO case, but to treat two people suffering from unexplained anxiety and distress. He wanted to understand what was causing their symptoms, regardless of whether the underlying experience was objectively real or psychologically constructed. The methodology Simon employed is crucial to understanding why these sessions carry such weight. He insisted on keeping Betty and Barney completely separated during their individual sessions. Neither was allowed to hear the other's recordings or read transcripts of what the other had said. This was not standard practice for all hypnotherapy, but Simon understood that if their accounts were going to have any validity, they needed to emerge independently. He wanted to eliminate any possibility that one spouse was consciously or unconsciously influencing the other's narrative. When Barney underwent hypnosis first, his responses were immediate and visceral. Under light trance, his entire demeanor changed. His voice softened, became more hesitant, almost childlike. He clutched the arms of the chair. His breathing grew shallow and rapid. Then the memories began to surface, and they emerged not as calm recitations, but as lived experiences happening in real time. He wasn't describing what he remembered. He was reliving what had happened, experiencing it again with all the fear and confusion of that original moment.
The terror in Barney's voice during these sessions is difficult to describe, but impossible to fake convincingly. When he described seeing the figures in the windows of the craft, he began to tremble. When he recalled being moved toward the craft against his will, his body language suggested someone fighting against an invisible force. And when he described the eyes of the beings, those enormous wraparound eyes that seemed to look into him rather than at him, he broke down completely. Dr. Simon had to pause the session multiple times because Barney's distress was so acute. What makes Barney's testimony particularly powerful is his resistance to it. This wasn't someone eagerly sharing an exciting story. This was someone confronting memories that terrified him, memories he clearly wished didn't exist. At several points during the sessions, he expressed disbelief at what he was saying, questioning his own words even as they emerged. He wanted desperately for there to be another explanation, but under hypnosis, the memories persisted with stubborn clarity, regardless of his conscious desire to dismiss them. Betty's sessions told a different but remarkably consistent story. Under hypnosis, she described being taken from the car, moved down a forested path, and brought aboard a craft. Her account included details about the interior, the curved hallway, the examination room, the instruments used, and most famously, the star map. But what's often overlooked is how specific her descriptions were and how they aligned with Barney's testimony, even though neither had heard what the other said. Both described the beings as having grayish skin, though neither used the word gray at that time since that terminology didn't yet exist in popular culture. Both mentioned the large eyes, the thin bodies, the impression of intelligence combined with something distinctly non-human. Both described a form of communication that bypassed language, thoughts appearing directly in their minds rather than being spoken aloud. Both recalled being separated once inside the craft, taken to different rooms, examined by different groups of beings. The consistency between their accounts extended to small environmental details. Both mentioned the quality of light inside the craft, describing it as diffused and coming from no apparent source. Both noted the temperature was comfortable, but the air felt different somehow, neither hot nor cold, but almost neutral. Both described the surfaces as smooth and curved, without visible seams or joints. These weren't dramatic details that would naturally stick in someone's memory or be emphasized in retelling. They were mundane observations that nonetheless matched perfectly between two people who hadn't discussed them with each other. Dr. Simon documented all of this meticulously. His notes reveal a man genuinely puzzled by what he was hearing. He never concluded that an alien abduction had literally occurred, but he made clear in his clinical observations that Betty and Barney were not lying or consciously fabricating their accounts. Their emotional responses were too genuine, their distress too real, their consistency too detailed. Something had happened to them that felt completely real at a psychological level, whether or not it corresponded to objective physical events. The skeptical interpretation of these hypnosis sessions typically focuses on the possibility of false memory creation, the idea that hypnosis itself can generate vivid but inaccurate recollections, especially in subjects under stress. This is a legitimate concern in hypnotherapy, and Dr. Simon himself acknowledged it. However, several factors complicate this explanation. First, the consistency between Betty and Barney's separately recorded accounts suggests that if false memories were being created, they were being created in remarkably similar ways, despite the subjects having no contact during the process. Second, many of the details they described, particularly about the appearance of the beings, predated the common cultural imagery of aliens that would develop in later decades. They weren't drawing from a shared cultural template because that template didn't fully exist yet. What the transcripts really reveal, when read carefully, is two people genuinely struggling to make sense of memories that didn't fit any framework they possessed. They weren't crafting a narrative, they were uncovering one, piece by disturbing piece, and the emotional toll of that process is evident throughout the recordings. Whatever happened on that highway in September of 1961, it left psychological scars deep enough that even years later, accessing those memories produced profound distress.
The consistency between their accounts extended to small environmental details. Both mentioned the quality of light inside the craft, describing it as diffuse and coming from no apparent source. Both noted the temperature was comfortable, but the air felt different somehow, neither hot nor cold, but almost neutral. Both described the surfaces as smooth and curved, without visible seams or joints. These weren't dramatic details that would naturally stick in someone's memory or be emphasized in retelling. They were mundane observations that nonetheless matched perfectly between two people who hadn't discussed them with each other. Dr. Simon documented all of this meticulously. His notes reveal a man genuinely puzzled by what he was hearing. He never concluded that an alien abduction had literally occurred, but he made clear in his clinical observations that Betty and Barney were not lying or consciously fabricating their accounts. Their emotional responses were too genuine, their distress too real, their consistency too detailed. Something had happened to them that felt completely real at a psychological level, whether or not it corresponded to objective physical events. The skeptical interpretation of these hypnosis sessions typically focuses on the possibility of false memory creation, the idea that hypnosis itself can generate vivid but inaccurate recollections, especially in subjects under stress. This is a legitimate concern in hypnotherapy, and Dr. Simon himself acknowledged it. However, several factors complicate this explanation. First, the consistency between Betty and Barney's separately recorded accounts suggests that if false memories were being created,
They were being created in remarkably similar ways, despite the subjects having no contact during the process. Second, many of the details they described, particularly about the appearance of the beings, predated the common cultural imagery of aliens that would develop in later decades. They weren't drawing from a shared cultural template because that template didn't fully exist yet. What the transcripts really reveal, when read carefully, is two people genuinely struggling to make sense of memories that didn't fit any framework they possessed. They weren't crafting a narrative, they were uncovering one, piece by disturbing piece, and the emotional toll of that process is evident throughout the recordings. Whatever happened on that highway in September of 1961, it left psychological scars deep enough that even years later, accessing those memories produced profound distress.
The star map that Betty Hill described under hypnosis represents one of the most debated pieces of evidence in the entire case, and for good reason. It's either a remarkable piece of information that Betty couldn't possibly have known in 1964, or it's a coincidental pattern that skeptics have retrofitted to match actual astronomical data. Understanding which interpretation is correct requires us to look at what happened with the map and how it was eventually analyzed. Under hypnosis, Betty recalled being shown what appeared to be a three-dimensional star chart aboard the craft. She described it as appearing on a dark panel with glowing points of light connected by lines of varying thickness. Some lines were solid, others were dotted. Some stars were larger and more prominent than others. The being she later called the leader had gestured toward this map when she asked where they came from. When she then asked which star was Earth, she received that cryptic response about how knowing where they were from wouldn't help if she didn't know where she was. After her hypnosis sessions concluded, Betty sat down and attempted to recreate what she had seen. The resulting drawing showed 26 dots of varying sizes, connected by a pattern of lines. It looked something like a constellation map, but it didn't match any constellation she recognized. She filed it away among her papers, unsure what to make of it, but certain she needed to preserve it. The map might have remained a curious footnote if it hadn't come to the attention of Marjorie Fish in 1968. Fish was a school teacher and amateur astronomer who read about Betty's star map in a report and became intrigued by a specific question. If this map was real, if it represented an actual view of our region of space from some other vantage point, could that vantage point be identified? This was a testable hypothesis, a way to either validate or debunk at least one element of Betty's account.
What Fish did next was extraordinarily painstaking. Using astronomical data and star catalogs available at the time, she began building three-dimensional models of nearby stars. She used beads suspended on wires, placing each bead at the precise coordinates representing a star within 55 light-years of Earth. Then she examined these models from every conceivable angle, looking for any perspective that would match the pattern Betty had drawn. This process took years. She built multiple models, refined her data as new astronomical information became available, and systematically checked each possible vantage point. Eventually, she found a match. Viewed from the perspective of Zeta Reticuli, a binary star system located approximately 39 light-years from Earth in the constellation Reticulum, the configuration of nearby stars closely matched Betty's drawing. The larger points on Betty's map corresponded to stars known to be larger or brighter. The lines connecting them linked stars that were relatively close to each other in actual space. Even the distinction between solid and dotted lines in Betty's original drawing seemed to align with differences in stellar relationships, with solid lines perhaps representing major routes and dotted lines indicating less frequent paths. What made Fish's findings particularly intriguing was that several of the stars Betty had drawn were not widely known to the general public in the early 1960s. One star in particular had not even been properly cataloged until after Betty's hypnosis sessions had concluded. If Betty had consciously or unconsciously created this map from her imagination or from popular astronomy books, she somehow managed to include stars whose existence and positions weren't yet common knowledge. This detail became a focal point for those who saw the map as genuine evidence of contact. The match to Zeta Reticuli also carried other interesting implications. The star system consists of two sun-like stars, both similar in size and spectral class to our own sun. Both orbit at distances from each other that would allow for stable planetary systems. At the time Fish was doing her analysis, the concept of exoplanets was still theoretical, but later discoveries confirmed that sun-like stars frequently host planetary systems. Zeta Reticuli, being similar to our sun, represented exactly the kind of system where life might plausibly develop. However, skeptics raised important objections to Fish's conclusions. Carl Sagan, in particular, pointed out that with enough dots and lines, almost any pattern can be made to match some actual astronomical configuration, especially when the scale and orientation aren't fixed. He argued that Fish had essentially engaged in a form of data mining, searching through thousands of possible matches until she found one that seemed to fit. With no predetermined criteria for what constituted a match, the apparent correspondence to Zeta Reticuli might be nothing more than statistical inevitability. Skeptics also noted that the map lacked crucial information that would make it scientifically definitive. There were no labels, no scale markers, no clear indication of which stars were closer or farther away. Betty's drawing was effectively two-dimensional, forcing Fish to make assumptions about depth and three-dimensional relationships. Different assumptions would yield different interpretations. The fact that one interpretation matched Zeta Reticuli didn't necessarily mean that was the correct or only possible interpretation. The question of cultural contamination also complicated analysis of the star map. Betty had been reading books about UFOs before her hypnosis sessions. She had been in contact with UFO investigators. Could she have absorbed information about stars and space unconsciously, then reconstructed that information under hypnosis in the form of a map? The human mind is capable of creating remarkably detailed and consistent false memories, especially under hypnosis. The map might represent Betty's subconscious attempt to make sense of her experience by providing a concrete detail that seemed scientific and verifiable. Marjorie Fish defended her work vigorously. She emphasized that her models were built using neutral astronomical data, with no predetermined outcome in mind. She wasn't trying to prove the Hill story, she was testing a hypothesis using the best available scientific methods. The fact that she found a match didn't prove alien contact, but it did suggest that Betty's drawing contained information consistent with an actual spatial arrangement of nearby stars. Whether that information came from genuine contact, unconscious knowledge, or remarkable coincidence remained open to interpretation.
The star map controversy continues today. Modern astronomical data has refined our knowledge of the stars Fish identified. Some that once seemed promising for life now appear less so. Others, previously overlooked, have gained new interest. Advances in exoplanet detection have complicated the picture further, revealing that planetary systems exist around many types of stars, not just sun-like ones. The question of whether Zeta Reticuli specifically is significant or just one of many possible matches remains unresolved. What makes the star map enduringly fascinating is precisely this ambiguity. It's detailed enough to allow for testable hypotheses, but ambiguous enough that definitive proof remains elusive. It represents either a tantalizing clue embedded in Betty's testimony or a demonstration of how pattern-seeking minds can find meaning in randomness. Depending on one's starting assumptions, the same evidence supports radically different conclusions. And that ambiguity has kept researchers debating this single element of the case for more than 50 years.
Now we come to perhaps the most revealing and least discussed aspect of the entire Hill case, the government's response, or more accurately, the government's careful, calculated non-response, which, when examined through declassified documents obtained decades later through Freedom of Information Act requests, tells a very different story than the official public narrative suggested. When Betty first reported their sighting to Peace Air Force Base in September of 1961, the response seemed routine. An officer took her statement, asked basic questions about the object's appearance, movement, and location, then thanked her and said someone might follow up. 2 days later, Major Paul Henderson did call back, asking for more detailed information.
Betty complied, describing everything she and Barney had observed. Henderson listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and said the report would be forwarded to Project Blue Book, the Air Force's official UFO investigation program. The report that went to Project Blue Book was brief. It described an unidentified aerial object observed near Indian Head, New Hampshire, with unusual movement characteristics and no conventional explanation. The case was classified as unexplained, one of the relatively small percentage of Blue Book cases that couldn't be attributed to weather balloons, aircraft, or astronomical phenomena. Then, officially, nothing happened. The Air Force publicly showed no further interest in the Hills or their experience. But that official disinterest masked something more complex. Documents declassified in the 1990s and 2000s revealed that multiple government agencies were quietly monitoring the case as it developed. A 1966 CIA memo, released through FOIA decades later, specifically mentioned the Hill abduction claim and noted that recent publicity surrounding the case had resulted in elevated civilian reporting of unusual aerial activity in the Northeast Corridor. The memo's tone suggested concern not about the validity of the Hill's experience, but about its effect on public perception and behavior.
Another CIA document from the Office of Scientific Intelligence suggested that civilian abduction narratives, particularly those with physical evidence, should be monitored for potential psychological contagion. The language used is telling. The agency wasn't investigating whether abductions were real. It was tracking how reports of abductions spread through the population and whether they might influence other witnesses to interpret their own experiences in similar ways. This represents a form of social surveillance that suggests the government took the phenomenon seriously, even if it didn't validate the literal truth of individual accounts. FBI field office memos from the same period acknowledged monitoring the Hills as they became public figures. One memo from 1966 described the possibility of psychological manipulation being introduced via mass media and suggested tracking public reactions to the case. Again, the concern wasn't primarily about whether aliens existed, but about how the story was affecting public consciousness during a period of heightened Cold War anxiety. What these documents reveal is a government apparatus that understood the Hill case was significant, not because it proved extraterrestrial contact, but because it represented a new kind of phenomenon entering public awareness. The detailed nature of their account, the credibility of the witnesses, the physical evidence, however ambiguous, and the involvement of respected investigators all combined to create something that couldn't be easily dismissed or debunked. And that inability to dismiss it made it potentially problematic from a social management perspective. Project Blue Book's handling of the case is particularly interesting when viewed through this lens. The program's official mission was investigation, but by the mid-1960s, its actual function had shifted toward public reassurance. Blue Book existed partly to demonstrate that the government was taking UFO reports seriously and partly to provide rational explanations that would reduce public anxiety. Cases that couldn't be easily explained, like the Hills report, were classified as unexplained and then quietly set aside. They weren't investigated deeply because doing so might generate more questions than answers and undermine the program's primary purpose of reassurance. The decision not to follow up with the Hills after their initial report may have been less about skepticism and more about avoiding complications. A thorough investigation would have required interviewing witnesses, examining physical evidence, and potentially validating aspects of an account that challenged conventional understanding. It was easier and safer to file the report, note it as unexplained, and move on. This approach protected the program's credibility while avoiding the risk of either validating something extraordinary or appearing to have missed something important. Documents also reveal that various military and intelligence agencies were separately tracking UFO reports during this period, often without coordinating with each other. The Air Force had Project Blue Book. The CIA had its own monitoring programs. The FBI tracked cases that might involve national security concerns or potential hoaxes. This fragmented approach meant that no single agency had a complete picture of what was being reported or how different cases might relate to each other. The Hill's experience existed in multiple government files simultaneously, viewed through different bureaucratic lenses, but never comprehensively analyzed. When the Hills became public figures in 1965 and 66, this government monitoring intensified but remained covert. Declassified documents show that various agencies noted the media coverage, tracked the publication of the interrupted journey, and monitored public reactions to the case. But publicly, the government maintained its position of disinterest. Officials gave no interviews about the case, offered no public assessments, and declined to validate or debunk the Hills' account. This silence was strategic, avoiding both the complications of engagement and the appearance of dismissiveness that might have generated more public interest. The most revealing documents came from internal discussions about how to handle the growing public interest in UFO phenomena generally and abduction cases specifically. Memos from the late 1960s show officials wrestling with how to respond to a phenomenon that clearly resonated with significant portions of the population, but didn't fit into comfortable explanatory frameworks. The usual debunking tactics, suggesting misidentification or hoaxes, weren't working as effectively with cases like the Hills, where the witnesses were credible and the accounts were detailed.
What emerges from these declassified files is a picture of government agencies that took the Hill case and similar reports more seriously behind the scenes than their public statements suggested. They didn't necessarily believe in extraterrestrial visitation, but they recognized these reports represented something significant that deserved monitoring, even if that monitoring would never be publicly acknowledged. The files reveal concern about social impacts, psychological effects, and the challenge of managing public perception around phenomena that couldn't be easily explained or dismissed. This brings us to the present moment and recent developments that have transformed how UFO cases, now more commonly called UAPs for unidentified aerial phenomena, are officially discussed. In 2017, the New York Times revealed the existence of the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, a secret Pentagon initiative that had investigated unexplained aerial encounters. Suddenly, military officials, pilots, and lawmakers were discussing these phenomena openly, using language that would have been unthinkable decades earlier. In 2020 and 2021, the Department of Defense released footage of UAPs recorded by Navy aircraft, showing objects performing maneuvers that seemed to defy conventional physics. Congressional hearings followed. The term non-human biologics entered official testimony. This new openness prompted many researchers to revisit older cases with fresh eyes, asking whether accounts like the Hills, once relegated to the fringes, might deserve more serious consideration in light of this shifted official attitude. The Hill case, when viewed through this lens of evolving government response, takes on new dimensions. What once seemed like an isolated incident involving two witnesses now appears as an early example of a phenomenon that the government has quietly tracked for decades, while publicly maintaining various degrees of skepticism or disinterest. The recent shift toward acknowledgement suggests that officials may have known all along that something genuine was being reported, even if they didn't understand what it was or how to explain it. For Betty and Barney Hill, this late vindication came far too late to provide personal validation. Barney died in 1969 without ever seeing the government acknowledge the seriousness of what he experienced. Betty lived until 2004, long enough to see attitudes begin to shift, but not long enough to witness the dramatic recent changes in official discourse. Both maintained their account throughout their lives, regardless of skepticism or ridicule, and the declassified documents suggest that at least some government officials took them seriously, even if that seriousness was never publicly acknowledged. What the government files ultimately reveal is not proof of alien contact, but something perhaps equally significant. They show that the Hills were credible enough witnesses reporting something genuine enough that multiple agencies felt compelled to monitor their case and its effects. They show that official dismissiveness often masked genuine interest and concern,
and they show that the boundary between what governments publicly acknowledge and what they privately track can be vast, leaving space for phenomena that don't fit comfortable explanations to exist in a kind of official limbo, neither confirmed nor debunked, simply noted and watched. Thank you for staying with me through this deep investigation into the Betty and Barney Hill case. If you found this analysis valuable, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more in-depth examinations of cases that deserve closer attention. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on the evidence we've discussed today. What aspects of this case do you find most compelling? What questions remain unanswered for you? Your insights help shape future investigations. Until next time, keep questioning, keep investigating, and remember that the most interesting answers often hide in the details that everyone else overlooks.